Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Isentia Conversations, Communicating Through Change. Thank you so much for giving us some of your time this afternoon. We are going to be here for half an hour together, so grab a coffee, although if you're in New Zealand, maybe it's time to grab a wine or a beer. And this half an hour is all for us to talk about what's going on in the world. We started this Isentia Conversations webinar series 8 weeks ago, which it's hard to think about how much has changed in 8 weeks. And we were thinking about change when we started having these conversations at a time when so much is changing so rapidly. What can we do to support you and connect you with subject matter experts? And you're going to hear from two people during this session today, and I'm so excited to have these guys on board. We've got Campbell Fuller joining us today. So Campbell is the Head of Communications and Media Relations, the Insurance Council of Australia. And Campbell is going to bring more than 2 decades, I think, worth of experience working in corporate communications and as a corporate and public affairs professional. And so I can't wait to talk to Campbell about some of his experiences in his role at the moment. I think there's a lot to learn in parallels between some of the circumstances that he's worked on before, even earlier this year with the bushfires in Australia, and what we're all dealing with at the moment. We've also got Ngaire Crawford with us today, and Ngaire is one of a fellow Isentian along with me, and she is the Insights Director for Australia and New Zealand. And if you've been coming to these sessions more regularly over the last couple of weeks, or you joined Ngaire's special webinar last week, you'll know that she is absolutely passionate about communication. And as well as working for us, Ngaire is the chair of the Global Young Leaders Group for AMEC, which is the International Association for the Measurement and Education of Communication. And now that I've gotten those intros out of the way, I just wanted to let you know that we're going to have time for even more questions than we usually do today. We've heard your feedback. You want time to have a chat, ask these experts what they think about your questions, your thoughts, and we have muted your microphones today. And I know that that's a little bit of a pain. It's so much easier to ask a question the old-fashioned way, but we're trying to avoid a non-muted mic background noise cacophony situation. And after a week of spending the whole week on video calls, I feel like our patience is all a little bit low for those technical difficulties. So that means that the best place for questions is in the GoToWebinar panel that you should see on the right-hand side of your screen. And if we're talking about something that doesn't sit well with you, let us know. If you'd like to share your experiences or ask a question, pop that in there and I'll make sure that your questions get facilitated through to these gurus. Awesome. So I'm going to hand over to Ngaire now, and Ngaire is tuning into us from Wellington. And Ngaire, you're officially in level 2. How is it going?
It is good, though apparently the traffic is backing up for everyone going our way for the weekend to practice their diligent domestic tourism, as we all will be doing for a little while longer. But it's good. Restaurants are open. I can get coffee again. It's very, very exciting. I am just going to do a quick little scene set today so that we can jump into questions as soon as possible. I'm just going to have a look at a few quick media trends and then a little bit around how that narrative is shifting from, I guess, initial crisis comms response to that slightly different media tone that you get when you're moving into a recovery phase. So at the moment, across Australia and New Zealand, really mainstream media are focused on the easing of restrictions. And especially around the practicality of those restrictions and the easing of them, and a little bit of a link to a longer term economic impact. Obviously, for New Zealand, we had budget delivered yesterday, so all of these things kind of frame that narrative. On social media, kind of aside from people being excited about the social connection and being able to start to return to a new level of normal, people are anxious. There's a lot of anxiety and confusion around the specifics of some of the restrictions. Generally, because life is going to look very different, these are the types of things that people aren't sure about and are often discussing online with each other. I've had a look at some of the Google Trends for the last couple of weeks, and really these kind of follow a similar vein. It's really around, for Australia, it's particularly around the coronavirus app. And in both countries, it's around the easing of restrictions. And weirdly, in both countries, also about Pete Evans, which was a surprise to me. And then I started looking into it, and it did make sense. Obviously, he's had a bit of, well, maybe too much time on Instagram in the last couple of weeks. And obviously, his relationship with My Kitchen Rules is now over. Those two things may or may not be related. Don't know.
So are you saying
there's
that
been a lot of interest.
Pete Evans news is reaching you in New Zealand as well? That was across both countries.
It's one of the top searches in both countries. Slightly higher in Australia, but in New Zealand, still quite keen to know what's happening with Pete Evans. If you want to flick to the next slide, Ellie. Cool. So just with that kind of changing context and changing narrative, I did just want to touch a little bit on what that next stage kind of is. And I think this will be familiar to anyone that's worked through crisis before. And for anyone that's seen me speak on this topic in the last couple of weeks, I've categorized good communication into these kind of three categories, so around clarity, compassion, and creativity. I clearly like alliteration, so don't hold that against me. Clarity is going to continue to be the absolute game winner of the next few weeks as well, especially as there's more information to communicate. This is also the time that media specifically will really start to dissect an event. Specifically how it started, was the response too slow, and trying to do that, kind of diagnose the blame so that someone can take responsibility. There's a real thirst for some kind of an apology from somewhere that we can see coming through, even if those things are really small. There's a lot of pressure in government press conferences about when information changes, are you apologising for that information being wrong? That's the kind of tone that's happening at the moment. And really, with so many new rules and restrictions in place, this is the time to be as clear and specific as is possible, and moving quickly when there's a mistake and acknowledging what you don't know or what you don't know yet. So that's really the shift that we're starting to go through now as life returns to new normal. Yeah, that's the full scene set for today.
Thank you. I can't believe that I know that we're speaking cautiously about recovery, and we're speaking cautiously about return to a new normal, but we've really all been on a journey together the last 8 weeks or so. Campbell, what has your experience over the last couple of weeks looked like? Have you been even busier than usual? How are you feeling as you head into this session today?
Look, it would be overstating if I said we were busier than normal. The Insurance Council has basically been flat out since September, with very little respite. So we've gone from the worst natural disaster season in Australia's history into the pandemic, and overlaid with that is a number of government inquiries, parliamentary inquiries, expectations from regulators, expectations from various community groups, all piling up on what is already a fairly full workload. And I think many people in the communications profession will be experiencing similar things. I think that in some respects, New Zealand is a little bit fortunate in that it has a central government that is able to provide some very clear messaging. One of, I think, the biggest lessons to come out of the pandemic is the importance of having that trusted single voice, even if that voice doesn't always get it exactly right, even if that voice needs to change its approach somewhat. At least there is a central portal. I mean, in Australia, our governments have been reasonably lockstep, and that's to their credit. But there is still confusion in the marketplace about exactly what it is that governments are doing and what governments expect of the citizens. And we have half a dozen different approaches out there, depending on purely where people live. So that I think is an experience that will steer communications into the next couple of years. There's a lot of things to learn from this.
Absolutely. Something that I wanted to talk about today was flexibility. Comms professionals are under so much pressure at the moment, and how do you retain that kind of flexibility? What has that looked like for you? What kind of work do you need to have prepared to stay flexible in a time like this when it's so outside of your control?
Well, that's a very good question. I think we're in the fortunate position that we haven't had a pandemic for 15 years or so, but we have had numerous issues and crises. And as an industry group, we have a very strong relationship with the member companies that we deal with. We have strong relationships with regulators, with politicians, with consumer groups, so that even though the circumstances aren't necessarily familiar, the approaches that we can apply to them are still fairly well established and accepted as ones that deliver the best outcomes. So it really comes down to having the resources that you need, having the empowerment of decision makers to take certain steps, and to be able to continually stress test your actions and your messages every single day. So for us, it is, we don't know what's necessarily coming down the track. No one would have predicted a pandemic, or very few people predicted pandemics as a significant interrupter to Australian and New Zealand lives. But we can predict the fact that there will be external stresses, and that as an industry, we need to respond. And it does come down to, it does come down to knowing your stuff, knowing your product well enough that you can design a message or modify a message or modify an approach so that it becomes fit for purpose. And along with that is having a single trusted voice wherever possible on all issues, making sure you know who's saying what about those issues, making sure that you are in constant connection with your most important groups. And I don't think there'll be a person, and hi to actually many former colleagues out there on this teleconference. I don't think it would surprise anyone for me to say your most important group is your internal audience. Your own colleagues, your own staff. You need to manage their expectations from the start. You need to let them know that you actually know what you're doing. You need to let them know that they are important to you. You need to look at your external stakeholders. For us, we have 56 member companies. Each of those member companies has between half a dozen to tens of thousands of employees. So the importance of the Insurance Council getting its messages right, getting its approach right, whether it's talking to media, whether it's talking to government, whether it's talking to regulators, is absolutely critical. And so we try and run a very tight ship, but that tight ship also means we need to be actively listening to what everyone else is saying. And that's, I guess, that feeds in very, very neatly with the services that you guys offer, and that is around monitoring many of those voices, along with also listening through our government channels, through our regulatory channels, through our consumer liaison channels as well.
We've already got a couple of questions flowing through into the questions area. So if you are thinking that there's something that you'd like to ask Ngaire today or to ask Campbell, now is the time to write that in. But what I might throw to first is a question from Natalie, and she's referring to those concepts of consistency and continuity in communications that Ngaire was touching on, and it's also coming through really strongly for you, Campbell. And she's asked for your advice, Campbell. So how do you manage consistency and continuity of those comms when the overarching strategy is so unknown? And she's referred to being almost permanently in a reactive state at the moment.
Look, I think there's a couple of elements to unpack there, and I'm sorry I can't see questions at the moment, so I can't get to the detail. But first thing is that most of us will have had in place some form of issues or crisis strategy. We would already have in place processes by which we would identify issues, work out the best responses to those issues, work out how to collate the right information from the brains trusts in our organisations to be able to answer any concerns, be able to manage expectations, whether that expectation is that you have an answer or you don't have an answer. At least you can put in place that kind of feedback mechanism. And then it also becomes around looking at the issues that you have, tracking them out to the end game, looking at worst, middle, and best case scenarios, and trying to work out what steps that you would need to activate to respond appropriately. So I would dispute with anyone who said that there's an off-the-shelf solution to this stuff. I've never seen a crisis management plan that is 100% perfect, because the unknown is always something you're going to have to fine tune. But trying to stay one step ahead of the issue is really important. Now, we do that in a number of different ways. I mentioned that we are constantly connecting to our internal and external audiences. This is, I think, teleconference number, I'm guessing 22, 23 for the week. Last week we were up in the 40s. We are constantly talking to each other and to our member companies, and looking at the issues that they're experiencing, looking at their concerns, hearing about the direction that they think the industry should be going in, and then trying to work out how that fits into our current policies, into what our board wants, what our CEO thinks is the right approach. And we are constantly stress testing every single thing we do. And by stress testing, we are also able to identify emerging issues or predict things that are coming down the track. So I think when the pandemic first started becoming a topic of discussion, I think for many of us it was probably in January, where we started hearing word about issues in Wuhan. And that was in the middle of the bushfire catastrophe for the Insurance Council. So you understand it wasn't necessarily front and center, but we were already talking about the what ifs. What does it mean, firstly, for Australians in China who might be affected? What does it mean for outbound tourism? What does it mean for insurance policies that might need to respond to the travel aspect? And then what would happen if the pandemic started to flow into our region and into our country? So by February, we had already started putting a little bit of thought to it. By early March, it was pretty clear that we needed to start taking more direct action here. So we were one of the first industries to put a line through our events. So I think on March 4, March 5, before all the lockdowns really started to settle in Australia and New Zealand, we'd already cancelled our major industry summit, which was due to take place a couple of weeks down the track from that point. And we'd also put a line through the industry's annual dinner, which tends to attract 450 odd people each year. We'd also axed many face-to-face member meetings. We had moved a lot of our discussions online from internal working groups. So we were already taking proactive steps to say to our member companies and say to the broader community, yeah, we're pretty concerned about the impact this is having, and we're going to demonstrate our concern by seeking to protect the interests of our staff and our member companies. And the extension of that is, of course, being customer aware. looking at the concerns, looking at the issues, working out how best to shape those responses.
Ngaire, I've got
does that
a
come
little.
does that come to the
Yeah, for Natalie who asked that question, if you'd love a little bit more information, let us know in the questions area. I can link you guys up. But that absolutely sheds a lot of light around the processes that you use and how far in advance you're thinking as well. Another question that's come through, Ngaire, this might be one that I throw over to you, and it is a little bit of a crystal ball question. It's these ideas of clarity, compassion, and creativity. Are they here to stay post-COVID? Do we think that we're starting to see a media landscape that's shifted and won't necessarily go back to BAU?
I think clarity, compassion, and creativity, I think, are probably actually common right through a lot of different crises. I think the creativity part of COVID is particularly unique and pronounced just because it's incredibly rare to have a crisis that hits this wide an audience. It's very rare that everybody has the same issue at the same time. Not everybody's connected to crisis in quite the same way. I think that part of it means there's an appetite for having to deliver content differently and having to run your business differently and having to pivot around things that you probably never thought were an issue before. So that's where I think the creativity and the receptiveness of audiences to that creativity will have some longevity, especially around what this will do to changing how people spend their money and where they choose to, what businesses they choose to support and activities they choose to participate in are all things that will have a longer impact. I think clarity is one of the things that is foundational in any crisis comms plan, and I think one of the things that has been exceptional for people that have done well during this time is that foundational clarity. So having clear messaging really early and having that opinion as early as you can, and being clear and having a strong, especially from a government response perspective, having a clear visual brand, having clear places that information is found and clear voices is all important regardless of the issue, but it's been particularly pronounced in COVID because you can see all of the other government responses. You can see all of the international coverage. There's a lot of kind of armchair experts on who's doing well and who's not. So that all of those things kind of impact, and knowing that point of view really quickly and stamping it as soon as you can.
No,
yeah,
to that
interesting.
To that point though, you mentioned earlier the discussions around the COVID-19, the COVID app that the Australian government is encouraging. Taking that particular view, what perception do you have about the way that the importance of that app has been solved by government?
Yeah. Apps are always complicated because there is a whole raft of, there's always a whole discussion around data and privacy that become complicated. One of the things that's good about the app is that there is a consistent view of it. Generally for Australia particularly, the issue has been this constant tension between state and federal. So that I think is eased off as this has kind of gone through, and the app has helped that. Based on the social media conversation and searching, people still seem a bit unsure about it. If they're downloading it, it doesn't necessarily mean they're using it. If you're searching mostly how do I use it, how do I download it, there's probably a little bit more work to do and the benefits of it.
What do you think, Campbell?
Look, I think that there's a lot of behavioural economics that could be applied to solving this problem. They're getting a better understanding of, firstly, the concerns about it, and secondly, what would trigger a thought change. And I think there's a lot of information that could be used to steer the government and advise us through this. I mean, looking at the hotspots where it isn't being picked up, looking at the places where adoption has been very, very strong, and then unpicking why certain cohorts believe it's necessary and certain cohorts are skeptical about its efficacy or the security concerns around it. So there's ways of applying data to solving the problem, and I think that there's certainly plenty that could be done here, and it would be quite an interesting challenge for communicators, for economists, for marketers and advertisers to tackle.
I saw a former GetUp staffer saying that now would be the perfect time for the government to hire some former digital campaigners to get app usage increased. I don't know if that was somebody who was perhaps just looking for their next role, but I thought that was interesting. While we've got you, Campbell, because we've got five or 10 minutes or so left for questions. So if you are sitting on a question, now is an excellent time to send it through. I didn't want to wrap up the session today without somewhat picking your brain around what link you see between communicating during something like bushfire season and communicating in a pandemic. And something that I've been noticing is, so I lived in New Zealand for the Christchurch earthquakes. I'd already moved to Australia by the Wellington earthquakes, and something that really captured me was how quickly a group of people became earthquake experts. All of a sudden we were talking about liquefaction and the different levels of the earthquakes. It was like everyone had done a degree overnight, and I see the same thing happening. We're all talking about wearing masks and viral load and social distancing, and it's a population, like Ngaire was saying before, that's experiencing quite a lot of anxiety and is having a lot of new information quickly. And I was interested in your thoughts, both in kind of new scientific information all at once, but what can be learned from applying that lens to this?
Look, I think this is where having that single credible voice and monitoring the conversation and knowing when you need to correct something and how to correct it, I think that's really important at this time. The other thing is, one of the first principles of communications is, if you're not speaking, who is, and what are they saying, and is that what you would be saying yourself? So it's not just about speaking for the sake of it. It's looking at the reasons that you'd want to engage on a certain issue, and whether you're the appropriate organisation or the appropriate person within that organisation to respond. Now, it's not so from where I'm sitting right now. Lots of misinformation about insurance during bushfires. Every single time there's a natural disaster, there's a lot of misinformation, and that is our role. Our role is to correct that, but we can correct it gently. We can correct it with a fairly hard hand, or we can seek to steer influences to the right information. And so we use a combination of those factors. We try and head off the incorrect information. We try to shape the conversation so that the affected communities are able to know what we're doing and then take the right set of actions themselves. And then we were able to steer a little bit more of the conversation towards the recovery side of it. What are those expectations that people have? How will they be fulfilled? Now, we're in the difficulty we're in at the moment is we have 230,000 or thereabouts natural disaster claims in Australia right now, dating back to September, from bushfires, from storms, hailstorms, floods. It's about 4.6 billion Australian dollars in natural disaster losses. Combined with that, we have the impact of COVID-19, which is stretching the resources of of the insurance sector. It's stretching the resources of suppliers, of trades. We're seeing a shortage of some building materials coming into Australia, which means that bushfire affected properties or hailstorm affected properties might not be repaired as quickly as expected. We have social distancing on work sites. Everything goes a lot slower. So being able to say to a politician who says, hey, my constituent is having a problem here, why hasn't her house been rebuilt? We need to be able to say, okay, well, we can look at it, but here are a number of elements that go into the way that the industry is able to respond at this time to what would be, even in a normal circumstance, quite a long process, because we all know how long it takes to build a house or repair a house. So it is really about, I guess, accepting that you can't control everything, but being nimble enough to respond to misinformation, or even seeing that misinformation as an opportunity to shape a much better conversation. An opportunity here is really important. I mean, one of the things that I'm seeing at the moment is a little bit of a shift back to traditional media sources as one of the channels of trusted information. One of the go-tos for trusted information, and that may be amplified through social online, but people are still reverting to those traditional sources. Unfortunately, those traditional sources are also in a bind. There's no advertising coming in. They're having to reduce their staff. Some of them, the collapse of rural newspapers in Australia at the moment, and in New Zealand, it's a horrible circumstance. That means that we're relying more and more on fewer and fewer channels. And I think this is going to be a long-standing challenge to many levels of the community going forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, that the media itself is under so much pressure. Interesting talking about the media landscape before. We've probably got time for one or two more questions, and a really interesting question has just come through from Anthony, and his point is that COVID-19 has been used to blame many delays and other problems. At what point do communicators need to stop using COVID-19 as a catch-all excuse? And his question is, has public sentiment changed on this? And I guess it's changing all the time. What are you guys thinking about that?
Oh, look, I think that there is a risk that people are going to be get tired of that. Absolutely, no doubt. And that's where we need to start looking at moving from a blame to a recovery led messaging. It's all very good to look behind you and say these are the problems, and this is why we can't do something. Let's look at what we can do. Let's look at how we can shape a response that says, yeah, everyone knows that in our circumstance, everyone knows that building supplies are a little bit harder to get. Everyone knows that some services are going to be curtailed. But let's look at the other side of that. An example is with interstate restrictions on travel. So if you were moving from New South Wales into Queensland, you would have to go into a 14-day isolation, right? Massive issue. But the positive side of that for our industry was that we made arrangements with government so that tradespeople who worked in northern New South Wales were able to cross the border to fix storm damaged properties and bushfire damaged properties without having to continually go into 14-day isolation. So we have good stories to tell about the work that we can do even under these circumstances. And you don't want to make too much of it, because you also don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. But you can also look at the opportunities that are available to do our jobs, and that is, for me, I have to represent an industry. I have to represent the positions that our member companies have. I have to represent I have to look at everything through the customer's lens. What is the customer feeling? What is the customer experiencing? And how can we make sure that they're getting the information they need to make the best decisions for their lives under these circumstances?
I've got my eye on the time, and we've already gone a little bit over. What I'd love to wrap up by doing is throwing to both of you for your thoughts on anybody that's communicating extremely well at the moment, or anyone that's communicating extremely terribly. Ngaire, you've already covered Pete Evans. I think that means that he can't be an answer to this question.
Pete Evans isn't an answer to anything.
No, I don't know. It's a strange day when I have to talk so much about Pete Evans. I think, yeah, who's been doing well? There's been interesting lists coming out of communicators voting on which communications teams they think have done really well, with New Zealand government kind of coming out on top a lot of the time. One of the things I would preface that with is that, yeah, we all know that they came out really strongly, an amazing visual brand. That tonal shift in media is certainly at them right now. Clarity of information when you start getting into the details and when you start dealing with a public that are increasingly frustrated. So similarly to that that question that was asked just before, it's, yeah, making sure that you've got a way of keeping in touch with what the emotional tone is of your audience. If you do that through social, or you do that through any other kind of research or your own kind of information gathering, being able to tap into that and starting to see when public sentiment has changed and adapting to it is going to be the way forward, and how people will be considered good from this point on. I think that part of it is incredibly important now.
What about you, Campbell? Is there anyone you'd recommend checking out?
Oh, look, I'm seeing some incredibly strong communications on both sides of the ditch. Some leaders, some politicians are doing very good jobs, even if public sentiment is shifting. And I think public sentiment there may be some complacency sinking in, simply because Australia and New Zealand have done so well in managing this, and that of course is a challenge for the politicians going forward. But there's a handful of politicians who are doing exceptional jobs. The medical experts, I think, are in a bit of a bind. They struggle they have this constant struggle between providing detailed medical information, but being able to present it in a way that the public can understand and digest. And I think most of them are very, very good at that. Brett Sutton, for instance, the Chief Health Officer in Victoria and a former Melbourne High classmate of mine, I think that he's pretty calm, he's pretty rational. He seems like a sensible head around this. Some of the industry groups are doing very, very well. Insurance Council of New Zealand, our counterparts, and Leah McNeil, she's doing a really good job at shaping the industry's, the public perception of the industry's response. The Bankers Association here as well is doing a pretty good job. They're constantly updating information, constantly providing details on what that particular sector is doing to help especially small business and household customers. There are of course organisations that are doing pretty badly, and some of those organisations are organisations that have are on the tip of everyone's tongue because of COVID-19 outbreaks. I don't want to single any of them out, but I think some of those, some of the way those organisations have responded have not been particularly good. But also, you also can't crawl inside that organisation and see what is influencing it. When lawyers get involved, and you understand why lawyers get involved in these things, there are often some constraints around what can actually be said. So look, I think that by and large, there's a lot to be proud of. There are a lot of lessons that we can learn. I can see from the list that there's a few communication students online. So I'm sure these issues will be discussed at academic level and form part of a few bachelor degrees out there.
I haven't spent too much time looking at what the Bankers Association is doing, so I'm going to add that to my end of the day or weekend homework. That probably brings us to all that we've got time for today. Thank you so much to everybody for spending part of your Friday afternoon with us. Thank you, Ngaire. Thank you, Campbell, for letting us pick your brains and soak up a little bit of your expertise. We'll be running this webinar session again in 2 weeks' time, so not Friday coming up, but Friday the 29th of May, and we're going to be talking to Craig Dowling from Mercury for the perspectives of how an energy company in New Zealand is weathering what's happening at the moment. So thank you so much for joining us. Have a great next 2 weeks. If you are experiencing some easing restrictions where you are, stay safe, have fun, and enjoy yourselves. And thank you all for joining us today. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the questions as well. Thanks, Anthony. Good one.
Thanks so much. See ya.